Golden Audiobooks presents. Narrated by Andrew Hint. Cloud, the Smiter, by Arthur Gask. Chapter 11. Sons of the Jail. The following evening, just towards dusk, 3 men alighted from the train at Glenelg. They walked out of the station together and then stood quietly chatting for a moment in the road. "Well, so long," said one of them at length. "I'll follow you in 10 minutes. He took out his watch. Yes, in 10 minutes to the tick, and he walked abruptly away up the street. One of the other men grinned. "Andy's a devil for system," he remarked. "I'll bet he's not 10 seconds out," and they turned off at once in the opposite direction. First on the right, went on the man who had just spoken, second on the left, and then straight on for about half a mile. Small white house with willow tree and front garden. Right opposite large mansion surrounded by red brick wall. Walk straight in. He spoke in a monotone as if he were reciting some instructions that he had learnt by heart. For some minutes then there was silence. It seemed as if they were both oppressed by the importance of something that was about to happen. Then one of them spoke. He was the smaller and much more smartly attired of the two. "Really, I shall be glad to see his old phiz again. It seems ages, instead of little more than a year, since we last saw him." "Oh, he's all right," growled the other. "If he'd only cut out his bad temper, his rages." "Do you smell those sandhills, Burke?" suddenly interrupted the first speaker in great excitement. He dropped his voice to a whisper. "What do they remind you of now? Don't you remember?" His companion swore angrily. "Damn you, Phil. You're always on the jump about something. What the devil is it this time? The smell of this sand here, doesn't it call up anything to you?" The other looked round irritably. "No," he replied curtly. "It's just ordinary sand to me, that's all." But the man he had called Phil had stopped walking in his excitement. "Lord," he exclaimed, "and the whole place is exactly like it too. Why, Burke, these sandhills are the very like of those round that bungalow the Smiter had at Semaphore. And by cripes, as we walk here, it's just as we were walking that very night when we were spied on by that fellow. You know, the young chap we shot and threw into the sea." He stared nervously round. "I tell you, man, this road calls up everything to me. The night just coming on, the smell of the hot sands, and you and I just going to meet the Smiter." The speaker's voice began to quaver. "By hell, Burke, I don't like it. It's an evil omen. We must turn back." But his companion gripped him by the arm. "Come on, you fool. You're like a baby with your ideas. What does it matter if that night was like this? It was the same time of year, wasn't it? And the coasts are all the same about here." "But I don't like it, Burke," reiterated the other, and he shook his head. "I'm sure it means danger to us again." The big man's eyes began to glint angrily. "Come on, Phil," he said menacingly, "and come on quickly too. If you don't, I'll break your arm." The threat was evidently effective, for their walking was at once resumed, and in a few moments it seemed that the smaller man had recovered from his nervousness, for he suddenly commenced to laugh softly to himself. "Yes, I am a fool, Burke," he said, "but still I'm sensitive to things that you're not, and I notice a good deal more than you ever do." He stretched out and pointed with his finger. "Look, there is the little white house, and opposite to it is the red brick wall." He drew in his breath suddenly with a sharp intake. "Lord, look at that big house now," he exclaimed excitedly, "the one surrounded by the big wall." "Well, what of it?" snarled his companion. "You're like a shickered fool tonight. But don't you recognize it? Haven't you seen it before? The picture of it, I mean, in the newspapers?" His voice dropped to an awestruck whisper. "It's Clyde House, where that old man was strangled in Glenelg about a month ago." "Damnation," said the tall man, his interest precipitated at last, "and the Smiter living just opposite." He spat on the ground. "What a nerve!" "He did it, of course," added the other. "We said at the time it looked like his work. Yes, he did it, sure. But why?" The tall man was thinking hard. Why the hell did he start working so near home? They had stopped walking and were standing both quite still. Darkness was falling quickly, and they stared with something like consternation on their faces into the shadows up the road. The tall tall man was the first to recover. "Well, anyhow," he said brusquely, "it doesn't matter to us at all. The Smiter was all right a couple of days ago, and if he survived up to then, I guess he's all right now. Come on, we'll soon see, but we'll walk by first to make sure." They drew level quickly with the White House. A light was burning somewhere within, and there was a light also on the outside veranda. They reached the garden gate and were making to pass by when suddenly the tall man whispered exultingly, "It's all right, Phil. I told you so. Look, there's his binoculars on the table there and a box of his cigars. I know that damn blue label well. The old boy's been having visitors too, by the look of it. Trust the Smiter to do himself well." The light shone squarely on the veranda table, and there was certainly every appearance that several people had been enjoying themselves that afternoon. There were 3 or 4 empty glasses, a bottle of whiskey, 2 siphons of soda water, and a plate of biscuits. Also, several chairs were bunched close round the table. But the small man shook his head and wanted to hang back. "Oh, I don't like it, Burke," he whispered. "It looks a plant to me. The Smiter's much too tidy to go in and leave things about like that. Besides, he wouldn't have left the light on. It's not his way to waste anything, ever." "Oh, you fool," was the quick rejoinder. "You'll drive me crazy with your idiotic ideas." The voice turned into a jeer. "I'm going in anyhow, and I'll tell the Smiter you were afraid." And without more ado, the tall man noisily pushed open the gate and proceeded to walk briskly up the garden path. A moment's hesitation and, with a shrug of resignation, his companion followed. "Walk straight in," jocularly remarked the tall man, and he pulled open the wire door. "Good luck to it," he went on with gusto. "I smell cooking." "Oh, Burke," almost wailed the little man, "I smell policemen. The smell of their clothes, I'm sure." The lounge hall was in darkness, but at the far end there was light from an open door. A sound of rattling plates and dishes came from the back of the house. "Supper," remarked the tall man gleefully, "and a bottle of nice cool beer." He walked boldly forward. A sudden click. The hall was flooded with bright light, and big burly men sprang out from every doorway. There was an oath from Nathaniel Burke, a shrill cry from Philip Masterton, and immediately they were overwhelmed and the handcuffs were clapped on. There was no struggling on the part of either of them. Everything was too sudden. They were blinded by the light and blinked owlishly at their captors. "Good evening, gentlemen," said Inspector Romilly, who had appeared briskly from somewhere near the kitchen door. "You don't know us, but we've been expecting you." He eyed the prisoners with delighted interest. "Ah, Mr. Burke, I believe, and Mr. Masterton, too. Nathaniel and Philip, your Christian names. We're members of the South Australian Police." "Blast you," was the only comment of Nathaniel Burke. "No doubt," said the inspector drily, and he turned to 2 men who had just come off the veranda into the hall. "All right," he asked. "They came quite alone?" "Yes, sir," was the reply. "We picked them up at the end of the road, and there was no one else with them. We watched them all along." Burke looked at the clock in the hall. It wanted 17 minutes to 8. "Search them," said the inspector, "and do it thoroughly now. Mind, they are not ordinary men." But the search revealed nothing of much interest except that Burke was carrying an automatic in his hip pocket, and they each had to return half of a ticket to the city. "Where have you been putting up?" asked the inspector sharply. "It's no good attempting now to hide anything. It'll all come out." Burke flashed a covert glance at his companion, and his lips curled into a sneer. "You've got the wrong end of the stick this time, Mr. Policeman," he said coolly. "We don't know what you mean. We're respectable people, and we've got nothing to hide." "Nothing to hide," said the inspector drily. "What about this automatic, for instance?" "What does that prove?" said Burke, beginning to bluster. "Because a man's got a pistol, does that prove he's anybody you try to make out?" The inspector eyed him sardonically. "You're a fool, man, to try to bluff us now," he said, "and it's only wasting time. You're Burke right enough, and you've been wanted for years." The prisoner again looked up at the clock. It was 14 minutes to 8. He smiled almost amiably at the inspector. "Who is it you say I am?" But the inspector did not deign to reply, and he turned to the other man. "You're Masterton," he said sternly, "and your sense will tell you that the game's up. You've nothing to gain by lying, for you'll both be identified from Sydney within 48 hours. His voice took on quite a friendly tone. "Now tell us where you've you've been stopping in the city." The tall man interrupted violently. "Don't say a word, Marmaduke," he cried. "Let them find out for themselves. You can explain to them, of course, that you're in training for the ministry and are a most refined and good young man. That's quite all right." The inspector turned sharply on the speaker. He sensed suddenly that the man was fooling for some reason, and he wanted to fathom what was going on. Burke glared at him defiantly. "Look away, Mr. Nosy Policeman. Stare at me as long as you like. Where'd you think you've seen me before? Was it at the chapel the other night?" The inspector eyed him contemptuously. "Pick him up," he said sternly. "We won't waste any more time." But Burke appeared suddenly to have become faint. "Give us a drink of water, please," he said hoarsely. "You hurt me when you pushed me down." The inspector made a sign to one of the detectives, and a glass of water was brought to the prisoner. "Steady on," said Burke. "I can't drink too fast. Let me hold it myself." There was a minute's silence, and he sipped the water slowly as if it were some delicious wine. Then covertly, he looked again at the clock. It wanted exactly 7 minutes to 8. "Damn!" he swore explosively, and his voice rose instantly to a loud shout. "The police, are you? Damn all the police, I say da. The police, the police. You'll jail us, will you? You damned police, you'll—" The inspector darted forward suddenly. He understood everything now. "Stop him," he cried. "Stop him. He's shouting to put someone wise. Quick, quick, there'll be another of them outside." 3 of the detectives sprang simultaneously to the door, but quick as they were, there was one quicker. Burke literally leapt from the chair where he had been placed and flung himself handcuffed as he was upon the floor before the door. He clung viciously to the post, kicking and yelling the whole time, and outnumbered though he was, it was a full minute before he could be pulled away. Then it was found that the door had become jammed in the struggling, and another minute slipped by before it could be finally wrenched open. The detectives tore down the garden path. A woman and 2 little boys were standing open-mouthed by the gate. They had stopped in passing, interested to know what all the shouting was about. "Seen anyone about here?" cried one of the detectives. "Just before we came out, there was a man in front of us," said the woman. "He was just inside the gate, but he came out again when he heard the shouting and he didn't wait." "Which way did he go?" asked the inspector, who had followed his men down to the gate. "We're police officers and we want him quick." "I don't know," said the woman hesitatingly. "I was watching the house." The detectives looked round up and down the road and in every direction, but to their chagrin the whole place was quite deserted and there was no one anywhere in sight. They had no idea which way to run. "Never mind," quickly said the inspector. "We may get him yet. He should be Andrew, the garroter, the last of the gang. He's of medium size, good looking and with dark eyes, and now he's scared he'll almost certainly double back the same way he came. He has no reason to believe we know anything about him, but it's an even chance he came out with these other 2 from the city, and if so, they of course all took their tickets at the same time. We've got the return halves of those men inside, and the number of his ticket therefore will be either one after or one before theirs." They raced back into the house, and the inspector hurriedly sorted out the 2 railway tickets from the prisoner's belongings. "Second class to Adelaide," he said, "numbers 7423 and 7424. Therefore the man we want will have either 7422 or 7425. Get on the telephone quick for everyone to be examined at the barriers. It looks a good thing to me." 2 of the detectives instantly went off, and the inspector turned his attention again to the prisoners. Burke had got a nasty cut on his forehead in the scrimmage, and a policeman was now rendering him first aid. So, my friend," said the inspector not unkindly, "you certainly scored one against us there, but I'm afraid it's the last trick you'll ever take." His face broke into a pleasant smile. "But you're a brave man, Burke, and you stick by your pals." He turned to one of the detectives. "Give him a whiskey and soda, and make it a stiff one too." Burke took down the spirit with evident relish, and the inspector went on talking. "Well, I suppose you'll admit you're Burke now. You're Burke. That's Masterton, and the gentleman who's just given us the slip is another wanted friend, Mr. Andrew." Burke smiled amiably. The whiskey had not been without its effect. "You'll never catch Andrew," he remarked. "Now he's once got away." "Don't be too certain," said the inspector. "You heard about those tickets just now." "Who?" "Oh," laughed Burke contemptuously. "Andy's a thinker, and he's not a mug like that. He'll tot up every chance you've got against him, and our tickets will come into his mind first. You don't know Andy. He's got a brain like—" He stopped himself suddenly. "Like someone else I know. Like the Smiters, for instance," suggested the inspector gently. "I noticed you looked round, so I expect he's in your mind." "What have you to do with the Smiter?" asked Burke roughly. "Oh, nothing much," replied the inspector, "except that I interviewed him in this very hall yesterday." Burke stared hard at the inspector. "How did you come to get on this job here?" The inspector smiled most affably. "Well, if I explain that to you," he said lightly, "you'll have to explain some things to me too." "Hold your tongue, Burke," suddenly interrupted Philip Masterton. "Can't you see he's trying to pump you dry?" Burke scowled at his companion. "No fear," he growled. "I wasn't going to give anything away." He turned back to the inspector and for a few moments eyed him intently as if he were considering carefully what he was going to say. "Look here, Mr. Policeman," he burst out at length. "I'll answer no questions, understand?" The inspector shrugged his shoulders indifferently. "But I tell you what I'll do. Give me another drop of whiskey and I'll be a sport and put you wise to something. It'll be a good thing for you to know. Come on now. It'll be well worth your while." The inspector smiled. "Pass over another spot, Jackson, but not quite such a big one this time. Now, what is it you've got to tell me?" Burke drank up the whiskey before he spoke. "It's about Andrew," he said, grinning. "You've knocked up against something hot there, and I tell you flat I'll be sorry for anyone who stands out too conspicuous in this business." His voice dropped to a warning tone. "If it comes out now that we've got to thank anyone in particular for getting lagged here, then let that blighter keep an eye out for Master Andrew. Oh, you needn't laugh, any of you. It's dead truth I'm speaking now." His voice rose again in its earnestness. "Andy's not an ordinary man by a long chalk, I tell you. He takes things that most folks leave alone, and when he's got the dope in him, there's nothing on earth he won't do. He's like a weasel on a trail then." Burke gritted his teeth together. "And he's as bloody and revengeful as a stoat. Andrew, the garroter, you call him. Well, he's well named, that's all." "Thank you," said the inspector thoughtfully. "I'll bear in mind what you say." Burke proved a true prophet when he said that Andrew would get away. He had vanished as if he had never existed, and although the authorities were certain that within 24 hours of his supposed escape they had combed all possible parts of South Australia, not a trail or a trace of him could be found anywhere. Indeed, so negative were the results of all investigations that many shrewd and responsible people were not wanting who were of opinion that he had never been in the state at all. They put down everything to the natural suspicion of the official police mind and considered all broadcasting of the absentee's description as pure waste of time. 3 days later, the prisoners were all brought into court together, and an application was heard from New South Wales for their extradition to that state. The application was granted in the cases of Burke and Masterton, but refused in that of J.A. Cloud, the latter being committed instead to take his trial in Adelaide for the murder of MCIVER at Glenelg. The three prisoners had nodded in a friendly manner to one another when they had appeared together in the dock, and the Smiter had listened with a quiet, inscrutable smile to the details of how his two companions had been trapped in the White House. An intensely dramatic moment occurred, however, towards the end of the proceedings, when the presiding magistrate referred specifically and in most laudatory terms to the parts played by Inspector Romilly and Detectives Jackson, Frognall, and Hart in effecting the arrests. The prisoner Burke sprang suddenly to the edge of the dock and, refusing to be silenced, shouted that the four officers would now be marked men. He would not give a bean now, he thundered, for the security of their lives, and he prophesied that within a few weeks, at most, they would all fall under the vengeance of the still-at-large garroter, Andrew. A great stir was occasioned in the court, and some minutes elapsed before the interrupter could be silenced and dragged away. It was remarked afterwards that the prisoner-in-chief, J.A. Cloud, had nodded significantly as if he had quite approved of all that was being said. Chapter 12. MAUDE MCIVER. The arrest of Joseph Arthur Cloud, in particular, created a tremendous amount of interest almost everywhere, and a great sigh of relief went up in many faraway cities of the world when the news was flashed along the cables under the sea. In banking circles, especially, was the event received everywhere with the liveliest satisfaction. For so long indeed had he been a thorn in their sides, and for so long had he carried out his bold scheme against them successfully, that the very silence which for months had preceded his arrest had worried them not a little. They had been wondering amongst themselves in what new direction his activities were next going to break out, and in what unfortunate part of the world his offenses against these organizations would be resumed. The highest praise was lavished unstintingly upon the authorities of South Australia, and when the particular part that Inspector Romilly had played in the arrest began gradually to become realized, his achievements were in many ways lifted almost into the regions of romance. About a fortnight after the day when the Smiter had been committed for trial, Mr. Thomas McIVER and Major Poole met on the high road of Glenelg. "Just come back from Northern Territory," said the former as they shook hands. "But what a time you've all been having since I went away." "Exciting, very," remarked the genial Major. "But I suppose you've been seeing all the newspapers, haven't you?" "Yes, I've read everything," replied McIVER, "and I shudder every time when I think of that wretch Cloud. I can never get him out of my thoughts." "But what a devil he was," said the Major, "and how he took us all in." "All but Inspector Romilly," corrected McIVER. "He got on his track almost at once." "And how he stuck to him, too," said the Major enthusiastically, "and just bided his time. Never hurried, but just waited until the tick of the right second, and then click, and he jailed him right away. The arrest was splendid, and the act of a clever and brave man." "Pooh," said Major Poole, "but that's what one would expect of Romilly, courage and brains every time." "How will he get on with the authorities?" asked McIVER. "Will there be any promotion for him, do you think?" The Major pursed his lips dubiously and shook his head. "Too much jealousy, and not enough influence behind him, I'm afraid." His face brightened considerably. "But there'll be a good lump in rewards anyhow. He's sure of them." "Yes, and I'm to give him £2,000, added McIVER. "I offered that for the capture of the criminal. Now that reminds me, how can I give it him, Major? What's the best way?" "What do you mean?" asked Major Poole. "Why, should I send it him by post? Should I call upon him? Or should I suggest he comes up to the house to fetch it?" "Ask him up to dinner," said the Major promptly, "and let him sit next to the pretty Maude." He smiled knowingly. "I believe he's rather smitten in that quarter. In fact, I'm sure of it." Thomas McIVER frowned. "He's a policeman, Major, isn't he?" he said. The Major bristled up. "Yes, and by gad he's a gentleman too." He eyed the old man very sternly. "Do you know, sir, that for 6 months he was my superior officer in France? He was one of the finest men we had, and was decorated for gallantry on the field. He's a DSO." "Oh, I didn't know anything of that," said McIVER, looking rather uncomfortable. "But I certainly admit he quite looks the part." "Yes," went on Major Poole, "everybody thought a lot of Romilly then, and if the war had lasted another 6 months, he'd have been a brigadier at least." "Well, well," said McIVER, anxious to mollify his friend, "I will certainly ask him up. I'm very glad I mentioned the matter to you." "Yes, and you be careful about the money question," was the parting shot of Major Poole. "For now I come to think about it, I doubt if he'll take anything from you." He nodded his head vigorously. "You see if I'm not right." Mr. McIVER walked home very thoughtfully. He brought up the matter to his niece at once when he got in. "Look here, Maude," he said, "about Inspector Romilly. I think we ought to invite him up one evening. I've got that reward to give him, you see, and I want to do it as delicately as possible." The girl turned suddenly towards the window and busied herself with the arrangement of some flowers. "He's quite a gentleman," went on the old man, "and Major Poole says he was a major in France and is a DSO. You don't mind, do you?" "Mind?" laughed the girl, looking round. "Why, of course I don't mind, uncle. I like Mr. Romilly very much and think him a very interesting man. He's been very considerate to us too." Mr. McIVER shot a quick glance at his niece. It was unusual of her to express an opinion about any man. "Well," he said slowly, after a moment's pause, "we'll ask him up to dinner dinner for Saturday. We shall be alone then." In the meantime, the inspector had been seeing nothing more of any of the occupants of Clyde House. They had apparently dropped completely out of his life. He had thought a lot about the girl, however, and indeed, in quiet moments, she had been seldom out of his thoughts. Time after time, he had scorned himself for thinking of her, and one night, very reverently, but very deliberately, he had burnt the white rose that she had given him. He wasn't going to be a fool, he had told himself, and whined for what he knew well could never be his. So he would just forget her or remember her only as a very pretty girl whom everyone would, of course, admire. He made his resolve with the strongest determination possible at the time, but even in the next few hours he had reluctantly to admit to himself that it had produced very little effect. Directly he was alone, his thoughts harked back irresistibly to the garden at Glenelg, and in his dreams the proud, sweet face of Maude McIVER haunted and troubled him to the verge, almost, of despair. One morning, however, he received a letter in an unknown hand marked private. Its arrival stirred no interest in him until he noticed suddenly that the postmark on it was Glenelg. It was opened instantly then. It was from Mr. Thomas McIVER, and was a very short little note just asking him to come up to dinner one evening informally as a friend, and suggesting the following Saturday, if it were convenient. The writer added he should have asked him before, but he had been away in Northern Territory for some weeks, and had only just returned to the city. Inspector Romilly stared thoughtfully out of the window for a long while after he had read it. What on earth had he been invited up for? He asked himself curiously, and what good would it do if he accepted the invitation? They couldn't want really to make a friend of him, he was sure, and if they wanted to patronize him, well, he wasn't having any. It was just politeness, he told himself, and nothing more. He wouldn't go up. It would be a nuisance and a bother. He would have to buy evening clothes, too, and he would much rather put the money on a horse and give it a run that way. Then he thought of Maude McIVER, and his determination not to accept died away all at once. How divinely sweet she had been that last time he saw her. He remembered how she had looked at him that afternoon in the garden when she had given him the rose. Instinct told him that for one moment, then, the barrier between them had been miraculously broken down. Policeman and heiress they had not been then, but man and woman calling to each other as sex had called to sex down all the ages. How heavenly it had been. But there, he was a fool again. It was idiocy to indulge in those thoughts. She could never be anything to him. They were both in different worlds. He was a policeman, poor and with practically no prospects, and she was a rich heiress with all the Commonwealth to choose from for a lover. Still, he would go, if only to show her that out of his policeman's uniform, he could be just as were the other men she was accustomed to meet. It was chance only that had made and kept him a policeman. No one need be ever ashamed of him as a friend. Both in France and England as a major in the AIF, he had been on intimate terms with the best people in the old country, and their bearing and conduct were his naturally. He could flaunt it with the best of them anywhere. The following Saturday, therefore, at 6:30 precisely, he rang the bell of Clyde House and gave his hat and coat to the trim maid who answered it. For a moment the girl did not recognize the immaculately dressed gentleman she was ushering in, and then with a start and a little gasp of surprise she said demurely, "Oh, if you please, sir, Mr. McIVER wants to see you in the library first. He told me to bring you straight in." Mr. McIVER was writing at his desk, and there was another start and another gasp of surprise when he, too, realized that it was Inspector Romilly who had entered. "Good man," he said heartily, at once coming forward to shake hands. "I'm very pleased to see you. Now sit down here for a moment," and he drew another chair up to the desk and resumed his own. "I wanted to see you before we go into the others. I hoped we should have been alone, but two very old friends turned up unexpectedly today, and I had to ask them to stay." The old man seemed to hesitate a bit and looked rather embarrassed. I intended to write you some weeks back, but then I thought it best to wait until I saw you personally." He smiled kindly. "I hadn't forgotten my promise about the £2,000 reward, and I'm delighted to give it you now. You've deserved it, every penny of it." He took a sealed envelope off the desk and held it out to the inspector. "I've put no name on the check," he added slyly. slyly, but just made it payable to bearer. You can cash it over the counter, and no one will be any the wiser. But Inspector Romilly made no movement to take the check. He shook his head decidedly and drew back in his chair. "Thank you very much indeed, sir," he said smilingly, "but I'd rather not take it. I'm very grateful to you, though, all the same." Mr. Thomas McIver looked very puzzled. "What on earth do you mean?" he asked with a frown. "I can't take it," replied the inspector. "It's against our regulations to accept rewards from private people, you know." "Damn your regulations," spluttered the old man. "Do you mean to tell me you're going to refuse £2,000? Inspector Romilly shrugged his shoulders and sighed resignedly. "I must. It's very good of you, but I can't take it. But man, it's a fortune I want to give you. It's yours by right. I promised it to you. I can afford it, and you must take it." "I can't, Mr. McIver, and I don't want to. Look here, I've been a soldier as well as a policeman, and although I'm no saint, I've got a certain code of honor. I'm sorry, but I have to refuse. Please don't say any more about it, for of course it's a temptation to me." "You're a fool, Inspector," exclaimed Mr. McIver angrily, "and deserve nothing good in your life." "No, I don't mean that," went on the old man repentantly, "but I do mean that you're really stupid. I'm very disappointed with you." The inspector smiled good-temperedly. "Please don't be cross about it," he replied. "A policeman is a machine, not a man, you know." Mr. McIver shut down his desk with a snap. "Well, well," he grumbled discontentedly, "you'll be a worry to me anyhow. I shall have to make it up to you in some way or other, and it'll be a devil of a job to find out exactly how." Then his face broke into an amused smile. "You're a funny chap, Romilly, but come on now, we'll go into the drawing room. We mustn't keep them waiting any longer." The inspector drew himself up proudly, but not without some quickening of his heart, and followed the old man out into the hall. There were 4 people in the drawing room when they went in, 2 men who were unknown to him, and Mrs. Carter and Maude McIver. The girl was talking to the 2 men, but hearing the door open, she looked round and her eyes instantly caught his. Just the gentlest dropping of her eyelids, just the faintest quiver of the pretty lips, and with a becoming little blush, she rose at once to greet him. If she was astonished at seeing him in evening dress, her face in no way expressed it, and long before he had reached her side, she was the cool, self-possessed lady of the house again. She smiled nicely and shook hands. Then she introduced him to the 2 men. "Sir Charles Andover, Mr. Hiram Pellew, my aunt, Mrs. Carter. I think you already know." Mrs. Carter bowed stiffly and, almost to the verge of rudeness, stared Mark Romilly up and down. She had not forgotten how once he had ordered her peremptorily to come out and be questioned, and she had not forgiven him for it. She resented, too, that he had been asked up to dinner at all, and she was annoyed that he looked so presentable and well-dressed. Just as if he were a gentleman, she snorted to herself. Really, Maude ought to have had more sense, and Thomas, too, for suggesting it. But the object of her annoyance was not worrying about her in the least. He was determined to enjoy himself that evening, and was chatting in the easiest way possible with the others in the room. Maude McIver, too, was watching him, and for some reason she dare not even to herself explain, she was feeling quite proud that in appearance he looked such a perfect gentleman. Evening dress suited him so well, and of all the men present he was by far the handsomest and most distinguished. They went in to dinner, and the hum of happy voices soon pervaded softly through the room. Miss McIver occupied one end of the table, and adjoining her, on either side, sat Sir Charles and the inspector. Mr. McIver sat at the other end. "We don't go in for a butler, you see, Mr. Romilly," presently said Maude McIver quietly, when Sir Charles was for the moment replying to some remark of their host. "I'm afraid you'll find this dinner not nearly so exciting as that other one in Glenelg." "Heaven forbid," he replied piously, looking straight into the lovely dark face now so close to him. "I never knew what was going to happen that night. It was really a very anxious time." "Well, you must tell me about it someday. There are a lot of other things I want to ask you, too." Then she added with a sweet little half-bow of apology, "I'm afraid you must think us very ungrateful, my uncle and me. We've never written to thank you for everything you've done, but it wasn't because we weren't grateful, really. My uncle was away, and I couldn't very well write to you on my own." The inspector almost frowned. "Please don't say anything about that," he replied. "There's nothing at all for you to be grateful about. Indeed, things are all the other way. You helped me perhaps more than you'll ever know." The girl looked down quickly to her plate, but before she could say anything more, the genial voice of her uncle came up from the other end of the table. "Now then, Romilly," he said emphatically, "I want your corroboration here." He looked at the other two men. "Our friend was major in the AIF," he explained, "over in France and DSO there, too." "No, don't frown, Romilly. You're too modest by a long way. Poole was in here yesterday and telling us all about you, or we might never have known what an angel we were entertaining unawares. Poole told us all about what you did in France. Now, young man, you're getting red." "Don't worry, Mr. Romilly," smilingly broke in Maud McIver. "Major Poole was very nice about you and only told us things that as Australians we're very proud of. But what is it you want corroborated, Uncle?" "Oh, yes, I was forgetting. Now, Romilly, do you think you could find a single Australian soldier who didn't appreciate and wasn't grateful for the kindness he received in England?" "No, sir. I'm certain I couldn't find one. Next to the fighting, the happiest thing we can remember is the way we were received into the English homes. It humbled us a bit too. For those of us who went overseas will never think again that a good Australian is better than a good Englishman. We've learned our lesson thoroughly. There was too much of the village mind about us over here before." "Well, Major Romilly," smiled Sir Charles, "I'm very glad you thought we did you well. I'm in the Home Office over there, you see. Your boys were an eye-opener to us, I can tell you, and we might have been very jealous if we hadn't known you were all in the family. But you, yourself, you left the army, I suppose?" "Oh yes, I went back into the police." "You're chief commissioner here then?" The inspector laughed. "I wish I were. I'm only inspector, and not a senior one even at that." There was an embarrassed silence for a moment, and then the quiet-looking Mr. Pellew broke in an unmistakably nasal drawl. "Wall, you're a mighty creditable-looking one, anyhow. I must say that. Sure, if they've men like you for inspectors over here, to qualify for commissioners, they'll be wanting field marshals and archangels to properly look the part." They all at once laughed merrily, except Mrs. Carter, who took up the conversation next. "Oh, but Inspector," she said rather sourly, "you must have found it very dreadful to go back to police work, to see that the public houses close at proper time and stop betting and all that." The inspector showed his strong white teeth in an amused smile. "There are worse things than that by a long way, Mrs. Carter," he replied. "Point duty, for instance. Directing traffic is a horrible thing. You're always expecting to be run over, and in muddy weather you get just grimed up with mud. The motors splash you terribly." "Oh, now please tell us who drive the more carelessly, Major Romilly," broke in Miss McIver sweetly, bending forward in the friendliest way possible. "Men or women? Come now, be honest. I want to know. We're always arguing about it here, Uncle and I." "No, Maud, I won't have it," interrupted her uncle in mock displeasure. "You're corrupting the jury with your smiles." He appealed to the company generally. "How can the poor man speak truthfully when she's looking at him like that?" "Quite right, sir," agreed Mr. Pellew. "If she looked at me like that, I'd have to say anything. Major Romilly, if you speak, sir, I'll take back that pretty compliment I paid you a minute or two ago. You'll be as weak as I am always with a pretty girl." The girl pretended to sigh in disappointment, and the conversation drifted again to the other end of the table. She glanced down at her plate and then, looking up suddenly, found the inspector's eyes upon her. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming to the rescue, but I'm not ashamed anyhow." "I didn't think for a moment you were," she rejoined equally quietly, and then she added, smiling back, "I knew Aunt would never forgive you for making her come out that morning. She's always most good-hearted, but very prejudiced once she's fancied someone's offended her." After dinner, the girl played to them, and then later they sat on the veranda in the dark, listening to the distant strains of the band in Glenelg. The night was soft and warm, and the faint moon just broke through the shadows on the sea. A silence fell upon them all, and they sat each hushed in their own thoughts. One there was who watched the girl just by him, with her face turned sideways, and every line of the lovely profile showing up clear against the sky. He noted noted the beautiful low forehead, the curving of the sweetly parted lips, the chin that told of character, and the queenly poise of the shapely little head. His eyes followed longingly the lines of the slim, proud neck, and rapturously he took in the rise and fall of the exquisitely molded bosom. An angel almost he thought her, and of the very type of woman that in all ages had atoned for the pains and disappointments of life, and made love the great eternal recompense for the sorrows of the world. And Maud, what of Maud? All like a fierce and terrifying storm had love come into her life. She hardly herself knew exactly what had happened yet, but she realized there was something different in every way about her. Her very body seemed to have undergone some wonderful physical change, and all her senses throbbed with some strange and new emotion trying to express itself in 1,000 different ways. There were thoughts and longings that she did not understand, thoughts that frightened her, and longings that she dared not dwell on for their very wonder. She had known nothing of love before, and had been scornful that sentiment would ever touch her. But now here, she herself was full of sighs and tremblings, and all because of this man by her side. She could not help admiring him, and oh, how she hoped that he would think that she was pleasing too. But she must hide it all because she was a woman and not supposed, of course, to have the feelings that a man would have. She must be cold, or he would think her forward, and for all the world she must not let him see that she admired him and was already thinking of him as her lord. She looked straight out before her to the sea, but all the while she knew that he was watching her. Inspector Romilly came out of his delicious reverie with a sigh, and, looking guiltily round, saw that the grizzled old Hiram Pellew was observing him with what he thought was a faintly amused smile. Throwing away his cigarette, he got up to make his goodbyes. Just an ordinary leave-taking, he told himself, and then back into the old world again to stifle all his longings and forget. He was thanking and saying goodbye to Maud when her uncle said they would both come down through the garden to see him out. They walked down the path talking of nothing in particular and stopped just by the garden gate. "Well, Mr. Romilly," said the old man genially, "now you've found your way up here unofficially, we hope you'll often give us a look up when you're disengaged and have got the time." "I shall be very pleased to," replied the inspector. "I've enjoyed myself immensely. It's been such a perfect night too. By Jove, how beautifully your flowers smell here. Water, my boy, water. That's the whole secret of it all. Maud, give him a flower for a buttonhole. I'm sure he deserves it." The girl moved up to the trellis where the roses twined. It was the same trellis from where she had picked the white rose that day he so well remembered, but which now seemed so long ago. Mark Romilly felt his heart stand still. For a moment she seemed to hesitate as if she were looking for some particular bloom. Then with the same pretty movement as once before, she handed him a flower. Again it was a rose, but this time the color of it was red. She turned her eyes away as she gave it to him. A moment later, and she was shaking hands in the cold and conventional way of slight acquaintanceship. "Good night, Mr. Romilly. I'm so glad you came." But her eyes were still anywhere but on his. She seemed to be looking on the ground. Then suddenly, just as he was going to turn away, she looked up and flashed a glance straight at him that set every nerve within him tingling. The lids were lowered, but he could just see her eyes, and there was the message in them that is old as the race is old. The undying challenge of the woman to be taken, and the bugle call to that uneven battle, where, in the end, the woman is invariably both the conqueror and the conquered. Returning to the house, the girl at once said good night, and sought the quietness of her own room. But her uncle rejoined his two other guests who were smoking on the veranda. "Nice chap, that inspector," drawled Hiram Pellew, "and very good-looking, too. I suppose all the girls are in love with him. Is he married, do you know?" "I don't think so," replied Mr. McIVER. "In fact, I am sure not. Major Poole here is his friend, and he told us all about him the other day. They were together in France during the war. Well, if I'd got a daughter," went on the old American, "he's the very sort of chap I'd like for a son-in-law." "What?" asked the old man incredulously. "An inspector of police for a son-in-law? You don't mean it?" "Sure, and indeed I do. But he wouldn't be an inspector of police long if I were interested in him. I tell you, Pellew. My friend, there are the makings of anything in that man. I've been a boss in New York State, as you know, for over 30 years, and I recognize grit at once when I see it. That man's never had a chance. He's a fine fellow, and damn proud, too. Oh yes, he's proud enough anyhow. He refused £2,000 before dinner this evening. Gosh, tell us about it, do. I'm quite interested in him. Mr. MCIVER explained all that had happened, and there was a silence for a few moments. When he had finished, Mr. Hiram Pellew got up with a yawn. Well, I'm off to bed, old man, he remarked. Then he went on appreciatively, fine climate this of yours, MCIVER. It quite takes the age out of one's bones. I feel romance in me tonight. Love's in the very air, and my thoughts go back to the old courting days. He looked keenly at his friend. Do you remember that girl in California, Thomas? We were only boys then. The little dark one. I forget her name. You used to take her roses, but her father wouldn't have you anyhow because you weren't strong in the dollar line then. She married that fat Dutchman afterwards. Nice little thing she was. It quite spoilt her life. He yawned again. Lovely girl. Your niece, Thomas. Some man's going to be happy there. But take care of her, my boy, and keep the bounders away. I shouldn't think she wants a rich man, but she wants a decent one anyhow. And with a final good night, he went off to bed. There were 3 people in the house that night who took a long while getting off to sleep. Maude, because she was in love. Hiram Pellew, because he had taken a particular fancy to Mark Romilly, and, guessing that the latter was in love with Maude, was worrying his very active brain to devise how best he might be able to help them, and old Thomas MCIVER himself, because he was troubling about all the parties concerned. To begin with, his old friend Pellew had ruthlessly started him on a train of thought that was always a very painful one to him. A confirmed old bachelor, he had nevertheless been once very much in love. As a young man, he had ardently loved this little Californian girl to whom his friend had so tactlessly referred, and it had been the great sorrow of his life that he had allowed himself to be so weakly driven from her side. He ought to have stuck to her at any cost, he was always telling himself, and in the end, she would have certainly been his. His weakness had soured his life, and the memory of it was always painful even after all these years. Then, Pellew had spoken pointedly about some happy man who would be marrying Maude one day, and it would be no good pretending that he was unaware of what was in Pellew's mind at the moment. It was not that he disliked the inspector, or was in any way a snob. He did like the man, and admired him very much indeed. That evening he had looked what he was, a perfect gentleman, and as Maude's husband he would be a credit to her beauty and her wealth. But a man who had been a policeman, what on earth would people say? Of course, he wouldn't be giving even the remote possibility of such a thing a moment's thought if Pellew's remark had not set him thinking about a lot of little things that he had noticed lately about his niece. She was very interested in Romilly, as she had openly admitted, and only the previous day she had brazenly pumped Major Poole to find out all about him. He had joked with her about it afterwards, and he remembered now that she had blushed a good deal. Then she had fallen in so readily with the suggestion that the inspector should be asked up to dinner when he was given that check. His sister had been strongly against his coming, but Maude had quietly put her foot down, and as the house and everything about it was hers, she had, of course, at once got her way. Then, too, he remembered she had been rather put out when Andover and Pellew had arrived suddenly from Melbourne, and as old and lifelong friends of his, he had said he couldn't well do otherwise than ask them to stay at the house. She had been upset evidently because the inspector would not be dining with them alone. Then that night also she had been much more talkative than she generally was, and several times he had noticed her and Romilly carrying on a little conversation by themselves at dinner. It was so unlike Maude to be interested particularly in any man. Altogether he thought it was very annoying, for it was no good forgetting that the girl was a rich heiress and a splendid catch for any impecunious fortune hunter who was on the lookout. It was long after midnight before he got to sleep. 2 days after the dinner, Inspector Romilly was riding down the Great Port Road. He was a fine horseman, and many an approving glance was thrown in his direction as he rode along. But he noticed no one on his way. He seemed preoccupied and thoughtful, and there was an air of melancholy on his face. Presently a big big touring car flashed up. It was being driven rapidly and held but a single occupant. The driver, when just level, glanced casually towards the inspector and then, evidently recognizing him, pulled up sharply. "Morning, Inspector," called out a hearty voice. "But sure, you've not forgotten me already?" "Certainly not," the inspector replied at once. "I should remember you anywhere, Mr. Pellew." They chatted for a few minutes, and then the American, looking at his watch, said he must go. "Say, Mr. Inspector," he said questioningly, with his foot out on the clutch, "isn't this darn land of yours supposed to be a democratic country?" "Yes, and it is too. Everyone's as good as everybody else here, or we're taught so at all events." Mr. Hiram Pellew raised his eyebrows slightly as if surprised. "Wall, some of you seem darn slow anyhow," he drawled quietly. "What do you mean?" asked Inspector Romilly, puzzled at the drift of his remarks. "Sure, in my country we don't expect the gals to do all the courting, that's all. See?" And before the astonished inspector could think of any reply, he slipped in the clutch and was off down the road. Chapter 13. The Help of LAROSE. The trial of Joseph Arthur Cloud for the murder at Glenelg was one of the very briefest on the capital charge ever recorded in the state of South Australia. The prisoner made no attempt at any defense and listened with cynical indifference to the marshalling of all the evidence against him. Merciless himself, he had been always in his dealings with the community, and now he, in his turn, expected no mercy from them. He sat in the dock between two warders, a cold and dominating personality, with his face the perfect study of untroubled repose. And his composure was in no way assumed either, but seemed rather the natural expression of a calm and even disposition. Only once did he appear to evince any interest at all in the proceedings, and that was when Inspector Romilly went into the witness box. His eyes gleamed then with anger, when the story was unfolded of the long and patient vigil over the garage of Clyde House. "But I suspected it," he broke in scornfully, with the only comment that he made throughout the whole trial. "I thought many times that there was smoke coming out of the window, and if it were, I knew it could be only tobacco smoke from someone smoking inside." The judge bade him, sternly, not to interrupt, and he at once subsided frowningly, as if he were annoyed that he had been betrayed into speech at all. When the verdict of guilty was announced, and the judge proceeded to don the black cap and sentence him to death, of all there in the court he appeared perhaps the least disturbed, and he was ready even before his guards to pass down the steps at the back of the dock. It was noticed, however, and remarked upon afterwards, that as he turned away, his last look was directed towards Inspector Romilly and Detective Jackson, who were standing together at the far side of the court. His eyes had been seen to roam round, as if he were seeking someone, and then lighting upon the inspector, he had stared hard for a few seconds. A look of dreadful hatred had crossed into his face, and his lips had parted as if he were about to speak. But for some reason, he had apparently thought better of it. He had smiled a cold and sinister smile, and then, in an instant again, his features had been masked to that complete indifference that had characterized them throughout the trial. A learned professor of the University of Adelaide, a great student of the human mind, who had been a privileged spectator at the trial, remarked, when dining that evening with some friends, that never could he have conceived so callous an individual as the wretch whom he had seen sentenced to death that afternoon. The man, he told his hearers, had apparently had no interest at all in the dreadful fate that was awaiting him. He had seemingly considered himself as superior to all censure of the community, and he had left the court exactly as if he were still holding punishment in store for those who had offended him. In fact, concluded the professor, he seemed exactly like a man in the secret possession of a bomb. The next morning, Detective Jackson was shot dead by an unknown person in broad daylight as he was coming out of his house, and within a few hours, Detective Hart was reported missing and his body discovered later in the Torrens River with a thin cord tied tightly round its neck. The psychology of the crowd is not unlike that of the individual, and they are at all times slow to partake in the horror of a calamity that does not directly affect them. They may be interested and indeed shocked, but so long as the trouble is distant far enough from them, only in an impersonal sort of way. But once let that calamity come nearer, let it show signs of spreading so that the well-being of any or every one of them is in danger, then the horror of everything is at once grasped in its proper perspective, and a true appreciation arises of the evil that is within their midst. And so it was now with the inhabitants of South Australia when the assassination of the two detectives became known. They were roused on the instant to a state of consternation and rage. The murder of Mr. MCIVER at Glenelg had moved them to an interested and horrified speculation as to the identity of the murderer. The crime had thrilled and excited them, but the interest had been in the main an impersonal one, and did not come home to them particularly in their daily lives. But the murder of the two detectives was quite a different matter. It had in every way a most direct bearing upon their individual well-being, for it was a defiance to the forces that were protecting them, and it was a challenge to the authorities at the very source of their power. For the significance of their new crimes was clear to everyone. Vengeance had been taken upon the two detectives because of their part in the unmasking of the condemned J.A. Cloud, and suspicion was directed immediately to the one remaining member of the gang who was still at large, namely Andrew, the notorious garroter of New South Wales. So they were stung to anger as well as fear, and they called in 1,000 voices for the wretch to be run down. The more sanguine among them expected that an arrest would be made at once, and when no more than 24 hours had elapsed without anything happening, they began in no uncertain way to blame the police. What were the police doing? They asked, and how, with the description of the man so well known, was it possible for him to be still hiding in the state, or worse still, that he had been able to get away across the border? But it was all very well to decry the police. They could not make bricks without straw, and they had nothing to go on to effect an arrest. Detective Jackson had been fired at through his garden hedge, but no one had had even a glimpse of the assassin. He had been shot point blank when only about 5 paces from the gate. His housekeeper had been on the outside veranda at the time, but although within a few yards of where the murderer must have stood, she had seen no one. The detective, she said, had been starting for work at his usual time, at 8:15. He had nodded goodbye to her and proceeded down the garden path towards the gate. She had stopped to look at some plants, and then suddenly she had heard the sharp crack of a pistol. Looking up instantly, she had seen the detective stagger and then fall crashing to the ground. She had rushed then to his side to find him badly wounded in the head. Terrified at his condition, and knowing there was no one in the house, she had rushed into the road for help. The railway station of Goodwood was only about 100 yards away, and, seeing some officials there, she had shrieked for them to come at once. But a train was just then passing through the station, and for a minute and more, no one had heard her cries. Then, when finally she had succeeded in attracting attention, the unfortunate detective was quite dead, and no traces of the assassin were to be discovered anywhere around. The second outrage was equally as mysterious as the first, and investigation proved equally as barren in results. Detective Hart had met with his death with no witnesses to see him die. He had been visiting the goods yard of the railway station on North Terrace that morning. His mission there had been to investigate a case of petty pilfering that had taken place from one of the trucks. He had finished his inquiries and had left the yard just before 10:30. He had been last seen talking to a porter near the entrance gates, and after that, nothing more was known of him until at 6:15 that evening, when his body had been found in a clump of weeds just near the river bank. But that something had happened to him was suspected even before an hour had passed after he had been last seen, for he should have been up at the police court in Victoria Square as witness in an important case at 11 o'clock precisely, and it was unlike him to be even a minute behind time. The post-mortem showed that he had been first stunned and then strangled, and there were signs of his body having been dragged about 100 yards before it had been consigned to its final resting place among the reeds. It was concluded instantly that the two assassinations were the work of the same man, and the authorities, too, were of the same mind as the public as to the perpetrator being Andrew, of the Smiter's gang. It was known that Andrew was a man of reckless character and that next to J.A. Cloud, he, of all the malefactors who had disturbed the peace of the Commonwealth, was most to be feared. He was a clever, daring criminal and in desperate situations had many times shown himself to be a man of great resource. For a long time he had been a wanted man. His description had been broadcast throughout the Commonwealth over and over again, but the value of this was largely discounted by the fact that he was a great master of disguises and could so alter his appearance, it was said, that he was unrecognizable even to his own friends. The police of South Australia needed no spurring on in their endeavors to catch him, and in the days ensuing upon the deaths of the two detectives, the city and all likely townships were gone through with a fine comb. All the hotels, the lodging houses, and apartment places were visited, and through the press generally everyone was invited to make known the presence of any stranger within their midst. A reward of £500 was offered by the government. The chief commissioner of the police himself was at first quite hopeful and candidly admitted that he was expecting any moment they might make the arrest. Quite openly, he took the public into his confidence. "You see," he said to a press interviewer, "in all human probability the assassin is still somewhere in South Australia, for the hue and cry for him was raised so quickly that he can have had no opportunity to bolt unobserved into another state by a long-distance train. He would have known, too, to a certainty, that all arrivals anywhere that came from South Australia would be subjected to a most rigorous scrutiny, and he would not have risked it. Therefore he is hiding somewhere in this state, and if that be so, it is almost certain that it is Adelaide itself that is giving him sanctuary. It is not likely he will have taken to the bush, for sooner or later than he would have to come out for food, and on any suspicions being aroused, he would know we should have the black trackers on him at once. The outlying townships, too, would be risky, for a stranger there, at the present time, would be at once remarked upon. No, he is probably in the city now, and that is why we ought to get him if every one of us keeps on the lookout. His description has been published everywhere, and although he will undoubtedly have altered his appearance, still there are three things that should inevitably undo him in the end. He is a stranger to people here in the city, he is of medium height, and he has dark eyes." The chief commissioner here smiled at the press representative. "We must remind ourselves, too, that this Andrew, with all his cleverness, is no Superman, and he must somehow eat and drink and have somewhere to sleep too." The remarks of the chief commissioner made a great impression in the city, and everyone was at once buoyed up with a hope that the desired arrest would eventuate, at least, within the course of a few days. But when a week went by and nothing had happened, people began rather to take the view that the chief commissioner had overstated his case, and when a fortnight had passed and still no one had been brought to book, there were few, if any, who were not of opinion that somehow the assassin had once again proved himself too good for the powers that were. There was another aspect of the case, too, that was becoming now more and more insistent in the public mind. Had they heard the last of the garroter, they asked themselves, or were there more horrors yet to come? What about Inspector Romilly and Detective Frognall, the two other officers who had been responsible for J.A.A. Cloud's arrest? Were they marked out for assassination, too? And was the wretch Andrew only just biding his time to wreak his vengeance on them when he could? And it was not only the man in the street who regarded matters in this light. His apprehensions were prevalent in official quarters, too. One afternoon, the chief commissioner himself sent for Inspector Romilly, and he eyed him sternly when he appeared, handsome and debonair as usual, as if he, at least, had no care in all the world. "I don't like it, Romilly," he said gruffly. "If we don't look out, you and Frognall will be the next ones to go. That fellow Burke knew what he was about when he said you would be all marked men." "He told us something of the kind, too, sir," replied the inspector cheerfully, "when I got him that evening at the White House. He warned us then that Andrew would get busy if any of us should figure too largely in the arrest." "Then why the devil didn't you act on it?" asked the commissioner irritably. "With this type of man, precautions are never thrown away." "Sir," said the inspector slowly, "we are always threatened." He shrugged his shoulders. "But until the other day, we have always lived. It was a mistake anyhow that your names were mentioned when went on the commissioner. Then he added grimly, "But I suppose it was only natural. It was a fine piece of work." The inspector looked out of the window. Apparently he had nothing to say. "But what are you doing, man?" went on the commissioner brusquely. "For unless we get Andrew soon, it seems to me that you and Frognall are both dead men." The inspector spoke drily. "Detective Frognall is a brave man, sir, and he is carrying on his duties in the usual way." He drew himself up proudly. "And I, too, sir, am not unaccustomed to being under fire." The commissioner scowled angrily. "You shall both have leave of absence until we have got the man. You can go away." Inspector Romilly shook his head. "No good, sir. If the fellow means going for us, he'll only bide his time. Besides, it would look as if the force were afraid." "But I don't like it, Romilly," reiterated the commissioner in dismissing him. "We are fighting in the dark, and I tell you frankly, it will be no surprise to me to learn any day now that something has happened to one or both of you too." And that the commissioner was amply justified in his misgivings was soon proved, for less than a week later, and just 3 days before J.A. Cloud was to suffer the extreme penalty of the law, the dead body of Detective Frognall was discovered on the railway line between Woodville and Kilkenny, just after the passing of the midday train. An engine driver on a city-bound train was the first one to see it, lying just off the permanent way, and he pulled up at the first signal box to report. The police were at once notified, and the body was picked up and brought in. Immediately then, it was recognized as that of Frognall, and from the nature of the injuries, it was clear that the detective must have come from a passing train. His back was broken, and there were terrible injuries about the head. The body was still warm when it was found, and it was at first thought that the tragedy was purely accidental, but an examination of the carriages of the particular train from which he must have fallen revealed unmistakable evidence of foul play. In a smoking compartment 2 carriages distant from the guard's van, there were signs that a deadly struggle had taken place, and one of the seats there was smeared over with blood. The autopsy also, it was proved that he had been savagely manhandled at the throat. The authorities were stupefied at the daring nature of the outrage, for the crime had been accomplished in the middle of the day and with many people on the train at the time. Indeed, it was considered marvelous that no one had heard sounds of the struggle or seen the body being thrown out. No trace of the perpetrator of the deed was discovered, and in the feverish investigations that ensued, no clue of any kind came to light. No suspicious person had been seen either before or after in the vicinity of the crime, and at no station farther down the line was there any recollection of any passenger having alighted from the train who exhibited about him any signs whatever of having been in a struggle or a fight. The assassin, as twice before, had vanished like a shadow in the night. Upon the following Tuesday, at 8:05, Joseph Arthur Cloud was duly hanged by the neck until he was dead. He died cynical and indifferent to the last, and spectators at the execution said that the final expression of his face was that of a smile. Later, the same morning, Inspector Romilly sat alone in his room. He looked worried, and it was evident his thoughts were not pleasant ones. In fact, the past 3 days he had not been having at all a happy time. People had been making a fuss about him, and he could not appear anywhere in public without being made at once the cynosure of all eyes. Everybody stared at him, and he knew quite well what was in their minds. They were regarding him in the light of a dying man. He had heard expressions of pity from them, and once a woman near him had crossed herself and burst into tears. He himself was quite aware he was in danger, but he was prepared to face that, and it annoyed him that everyone should interfere in his affairs and take it for granted that he had only a few more days to live. The previous day he had been on duty at the races at Victoria Park, and the whole time he had seen people watching him. They had edged up to him and pointed him out to one another. Some of them, indeed, had almost seemed to expect that he was going to be shot publicly. He leaned back in his chair and looked despondently out of the window. It was dreadful, he thought, the difficulty the police force of South Australia were now in. They could find out nothing. They could make no headway. They could not even protect themselves. Something must be very wrong somewhere, for they were like children in the hands of this man who assassinated where he pleased. What a tragedy it was that they had no great detective among them. No great detective for instance, like Gilbert LaRose. Ah, LaRose. LaRose would have soon discovered something now, wouldn't he? He would have soon run the man to earth if he had been in South Australia. But LaRose was one of a million. He was a man almost with a mind inspired. He was a prince of detectives, a very king among the trackers of crime. His meditations were abruptly interrupted by a constable who came in with a visiting card and a letter. "A clergyman to see you, sir. He says the matter is very urgent, but will you please read the letter first?" The inspector looked at the card. "Reverend Thomas Bloggs, Sydney," he muttered. "Now, what the devil?" he began, and then his eye fell upon the letter. "Great Scott!" he ejaculated. "From LaRose. Now that's wonderful." He tore the envelope open quickly. It was a very short letter and dated Sydney 2 days previously. "My dear Mark, read the trouble you are in. The bearer of this, the Reverend Thomas Bloggs, is a friend of mine, and he thinks he can help you in the clearing up of these crimes. At any rate, be patient with him, for he is a good fellow. Believe me always, my dear Mark, your affectionate friend, Gilbert LaRose." The inspector read through the letter twice, but from the expression on his face, the second perusal left him even more puzzled than the first. "A clergyman," he muttered. "A clergyman to give us help. Show him in," he said at length tersely. "But if I touch the bell twice, come in and say I am wanted by the chief. You understand?" "Yes, sir," replied the policeman, and his face broke into a smile. "He's a peculiar-looking man." A minute later, and the Reverend Thomas Bloggs was ushered into the room. He was a man about 30, and he had an ordinary commonplace-looking face. His complexion was pasty-looking. He wore a pair of small pince-nez, and he had a weak, tremulous mouth. He had straight black hair, and he walked with a stooping gait. "Good Lord," muttered the inspector, "and this comes from Gilbert LaRose." The clergyman advanced hesitatingly. "Mr. Romilly," he said in a gentle voice. The inspector stood up and bowed. "The same," he replied, smiling. "You come from my friend LaRose, I understand. Take a seat, will you?" The clergyman sat down on the chair in front of the desk. In spite of his generally limp appearance, he was evidently a man of business, for with no further preliminaries, he at once proceeded to abstract a bulky envelope from his breast pocket. "Mr. Romilly," he began quietly, "I have been reading about the tragic endings of those 3 officers of yours, and it struck me I should be able to throw some light upon the matter. I consulted my friend, Mr. LaRose, and he advised me to come to you at once." "Very much obliged, I am sure," said the inspector, and he glanced down covertly at the letter of introduction that the speaker had brought. "Oh yes, it is I. All right," said the Reverend Thomas Bloggs, instantly taking in the intent glance that the inspector had given to the letter, "and that is Mr. LaRose's handwriting sure enough. We are great friends, he and I." The inspector reddened uncomfortably. He did not like it that his thoughts should be so easily read. "Oh, I know it's his handwriting," he said quickly, and he smiled to cover his annoyance. "I should know it anywhere." "Well, he thought I could help you," said the clergyman modestly. "I have read all the newspaper reports, you see." The inspector bit his lip to repress a smile. He did not really know whether to be amused or angry. Gilbert LaRose, of all men, to send a creature to him like this. The clergyman took some newspaper cuttings out of the envelope and laid them out before him on the desk. "It seems to me," he began slowly, "that some very important points have been missed, points quite unimportant individually in themselves, but which, if taken all together, link up the evidence in a surprising way and narrow down the field of inquiry to quite a manageable extent." He shook his head reprovingly. "I cannot understand how these points have come to be overlooked." The inspector reddened again, but it was with anger this time. He was in no mood to be trifled with, and the fellow's remarks were savoring of impertinence now. The clergyman picked up a cutting. "This is an extract from the report of the first inquest," he said, "the one on Detective Jackson, where his housekeeper runs out into the road directly after he has been shot. Let me see. Ah, here it is. She ran out of the garden to get help. There was no one in the road, but she saw some officials by the railway station. Now, she doesn't say how many officials she saw. She may have seen 3 or 4. She may have seen 2, or perhaps she may have seen only 1. At any rate, she saw someone in uniform there. But as to what the exact nature of the uniform was we are kept in the dark. He looked up inquiringly at the inspector. Now was it a station master's uniform she saw, or was it only a porter's? Probably the latter, for a train was leaving the station at the time, and it is the custom at all small stations, I believe, for the station master to be on duty on the platform to superintend. So in all likelihood, it was just a porter she saw when she ran out into the road. The inspector looked out of the window and repressed a yawn. He was bored. He had gone through them so many times that he knew all the inquest reports almost off by heart. Why had LAROSE sent this man to him? He asked himself again. It was beyond a joke. The clergyman went on, and his voice lapsed into a drone. Now we come to the second inquest, that upon Detective Hart, and I think I may remark here that I take it for granted that the detective was at least an ordinarily astute man. The fact that he had been 5 years a detective at headquarters and that you, yourself, personally selected him to assist you in the shadowing of J.A. Cloud both prove conclusively that he was experienced in his profession and had all his wits about him. He must too have been deeply affected by the manner of the death of his colleague, Detective Jackson, and have realized perfectly well that his own life was in probable danger from the same hand. Therefore, we may take it that he would be very much on the lookout, that he would be on his guard. The inspector had looked back from the window and was now intently watching the speaker with a look of curious perplexity upon his face. Well, continued the clergyman, to return to this inquest on Detective Hart, he had been investigating some pilfering from a railway truck, we are told. He had left the goods yard and he was seen. The clergyman spoke very slowly here, and his voice seemed suddenly to deepen and to lose its drone. He was last seen talking to a porter, a man in uniform again. The inspector sat up with a jerk. He drew in a sharp breath, and the hand that had lain idly on his chair clenched itself until the knuckles stood out white. His lips parted, and his face looked almost as if he were in pain. But the Reverend Thomas Bloggs apparently noticed nothing, for he bent, close-sighted, over a third cutting that he was holding in his hand. Now we come, he said, to the case of Frognall, and at once we have the railway again. Thrown out of a train this time, as before. A warned, suspicious man. Doubly warned, however, and doubly suspicious this time. A man who must have been actually on the lookout for the very end that eventually overtook him. No mention certainly of any men in uniform here. No tale of porters or officials, but still, the clergyman's voice became low and stern. As we have to fill in the blanks of those last few minutes for ourselves, is it difficult to imagine how safe a passport to his side a uniform would have been? How he would have been lulled into security by the proximity of a railway official of any kind? How a murderer in a porter's coat, for instance, would have been enabled to draw close? And how that dreadful neck hold would have been effected without the slightest chance of the victim breaking clear? The clergyman suddenly stopped speaking. It seemed the vision he had conjured up was affecting him, and that he wanted time to calm himself down. And he was not by any means the only one whose emotions had been stirred. The face of Inspector Romilly was the very picture of distress. All on the instant, as it were, he had been stunned into enlightenment. Chagrin and anger were struggling in him, for he was mortified to the last degree that he and everyone else too should have missed the line of thought that had just been suggested to him. And it was also probable too. A man in a porter's uniform. Of course that would explain everything. The assassin would have been enabled to move freely about everywhere, and even with all eyes on the lookout for him, no one would have given a railway official even a passing thought. There would not have been the slightest suspicion at any time. The inspector spoke after a long time, and he put as much carelessness into his voice as he possibly could assume. He had pulled himself together, and his face was masked and calm. Quite an ingenious theory, Mr. Bloggs, he remarked carelessly. The only flaw in it is, however, that strangers to this city do not get taken on as railway officials as easily as you think. It's a difficult matter to get employed on the railway at any time, and it means a long waiting, generally, before your turn comes. Who, said the clergyman. Whoever suggested, pray, that the man had got a job on the railway? All he did, probably, was to steal a porter's coat. The inspector this time got even redder than before. He was being taught his business with a vengeance, he thought, and the mortification of it was, his teacher was this stupid-looking man. "Send for the report book," continued the clergyman insinuatingly, "and see if any thefts were reported from a railway station or from some porter's house about that time." The inspector glared hard at the speaker, but the clergyman was now, in his turn, looking out of the window and was apparently oblivious of the ill favor he was in. A long hesitation, and the inspector touched the push of his bell. "Bring the report book, please," he said to the policeman, who immediately appeared. "The reports of last month I want. The reports for about the 9th instant," supplemented the clergyman very softly. "For the first days of the 2nd week." The door closed, and there was silence in the room. The clergyman continued to look out of the window, and the inspector was occupied in looking at him. Quite a different expression, however, had all at once come into the inspector's face. It seemed now that he was in a way of being only very puzzled, and that his anger had at all events died away. Quietly, but intently, he looked the clergyman well up and down. He scrutinized his face, his hair, the clothes he wore, and next his hand. Then he picked up the envelope in which the letter of introduction had come, and thoughtfully, very thoughtfully, he stared at it as if it were a strange thing, the like of which he had never seen before. All at once then, he smiled. A tap on the door, and the policeman brought in a large, thick book. He placed it on the desk and at once retired. The inspector took out a cigarette from somewhere in his desk and, having lit it, proceeded briskly to go through the book before him. "Perhaps I might join you," suggested the clergyman meekly. "I find tobacco very soothing when I have to think." "No, no," replied the inspector brusquely, and without looking up. "Clergymen shouldn't smoke. It's bad for their nerves." The Reverend Mr. Bloggs took the reproof quite meekly. He just sighed and continued watching the inspector at his task. "April the 7th to 8th, muttered the latter with his finger running quickly down the pages. "No, nothing relevant there." "April 9th. No, nothing there either." "April 10th. Ah, here we have it. This might be the very thing we want. Phone message from Ovingham Railway Station. Received 6:40 a.m. Station office broken into during the night. Entrance effected through skylight. Unsuccessful attempt made to open the safe. Thief probably interrupted. For nothing taken except about 10 shillings worth of postage stamps and some porter's clothes." The inspector leant suddenly across the desk and seized hold of one of the clergyman's hands. "Gilbert, my boy," he exclaimed with enthusiasm, "you shall have your cigarette at once. It was the action of a real pal to come all the way to help us, and I believe you've scored a bullseye, first time." The clergyman betrayed no astonishment, but at once warmly returned the hand clasp, and then almost in one moment shed his hair, his eyebrows, and his pince-nez. His face seemed to alter in outline, and the tremulous mouth was replaced suddenly by one of decision and strength. "But where did I go wrong, Mark?" he asked plaintively. "Don't spare me, for I'm always learning, you know." The inspector seemed as pleased as a schoolboy. "Ah, you young rogue, and don't you think I knew who you were all along? Didn't I recognize you at once as the great Gilbert LAROSE?" "No, you didn't," said the other decisively. "You hadn't a suspicion in the world until I called for that beastly report book. That made me think." "I admit, Gilbert," laughed the inspector, "you knew too much for a parson, I could see." He picked up the envelope on the table. "But it was this that finally gave you away." "How?" asked LAROSE. "It's one I brought with me from Sydney, and I wrote the letter there." "But you overdid it, my boy. You have made the envelope look altogether too travel-stained for the short journey from Sydney. I recognized your handwriting, of course, but it struck me the letter had been purposely given a rough passage in your pocket to convince me that it had been written there. Either that, I was sure, or else you had been slovenly in taking care of it on the journey. I didn't think the latter, for your other envelope there with the newspaper cuttings was quite clean and even unrumpled." The inspector laughed again and shrugged his shoulders. "A small thing, Gilbert, I admit, but it made me suspicious, and then I saw through your makeup at once." LAROSE put back his wig and eyebrows and adjusted his pince-nez. He was smiling now, himself. "Well, I give you one there, Mark," he said. "I ought to have remembered I was dealing with an intelligence like my own." He grinned in amusement for a moment, and then his face dropped back and took on cold, grave lines. "But look here, Romilly," he went on very seriously. "You're in great danger, old man, as great as you can possibly imagine." He lowered his voice impressively and outstretched his hand. "I know that fellow Andrew mine. He's been a thorn in my side, and I've known all his ways and tricks for years. He's a doped wretch who'll stop at nothing. He'll have you, Romilly, as sure as you were sitting there, unless we get in on him before." "I'm sure of it too, Gilbert," said the inspector quietly, "but up to now there's not been the ghost of a chance of getting in first." He reddened under his friend's intent glance. "I shall always kick myself that I didn't see what you've just pointed out." "Tut, tut," said LAROSE modestly. "I only noticed it because I was a long way away. You were too close to things to get the real perspective that I had. But look here, Mark, with any luck now, we'll get the man. I came over in this rig because not a soul must learn I'm in the city. I'm not boasting, but Andrew is a bit afraid of me. He knows I understand his little ways. I've nearly had him several times, and if he thinks I'm here specially on his account, then very probably he'll lie doggo and give us a lot of trouble before we turn him out. But say, Mark, none of you caught a glimpse of him that evening when you nabbed Burke and Masterton at the White House, did you?" The inspector shook his head. "Not one of us saw him. There was only a woman at the gate. Tell me exactly what happened. The little things as well as the big things, you know." "There's really nothing to tell, Gilbert," said the inspector sadly. "Burke fooled me beautifully that evening. We had tied them both up and I was questioning him. He was quite quiet and was not disinclined to talk. I noticed subconsciously, however, that he kept looking at the clock. Then suddenly he began to shout loudly at the very top of his voice and shrieked out something about damned police. He shouted several times, and at last I tumbled to it that he was warning someone outside not to come in. We rushed to the door, but the wretch Burke was there first, and it was quite a couple of minutes before we could drag him away and get it open. We ran down the garden to find only a woman and 2 children standing in the road. They had heard the shouting and had stopped to see what was going on. There was no man to be seen anywhere, but the woman said there had been one about a moment before. He had been just opening the gate, she said, when the shouting had begun, and he had at once turned and walked away. She hadn't noticed in which direction he had gone. The inspector sighed. "That was the nearest we got to him, Gilbert, and there has been no trace of him since." "What was the night like?" asked LAROSE. "Bright moonlight," said the inspector, "and there were electric lamps both up and down the road. But there were so many turnings he might have taken and so many ways he might have gone over the sand that it was quite hopeless, with the few of us there, to attempt to follow. The only thing we could do was to try and block him from getting back to the city or unearth him if he did manage to get back there." The inspector shrugged his shoulders. "But we failed in every direction. He had vanished and left no trace. The city was the last place he would run to," said LAROSE meditatively. "More likely the sandhills or the empty spaces by the sea." "We thought of that," said the inspector. "But on the other hand, we argued he would try to get to his luggage before we could find where he had left it. Remember, he had nothing but what he stood up in, and no means of getting any materials for disguise." LAROSE shook his head. "You don't know Andrew, my boy. He is a very fox and cunning, and would have thought out every move you could possibly make." "Well," went on the inspector, "we located within 2 hours where he had put up. He had got a room by himself at the Great Central, and was quite the grand gentleman to judge by his clothes. That's why we thought we should catch him. A well-dressed man would not be able to obliterate himself as easily as one in poor-looking clothes. We had got all his things for making up, too, and we knew he would be hard put to it to alter his appearance in any way. They remembered him well at the office of the hotel, and we got an excellent description from the receiving clerk there." "Let me see," said LAROSE. "That would be exactly 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks now from the night when he escaped from you." He looked thoughtfully at the inspector. "And from that day to this you have never had the slightest inkling of where he is hiding? No rumor or suspicion of any kind? No traces in any direction?" "Gilbert," said the inspector impressively, "for 6 weeks the city has been put through a fine sieve. The whole time we have had our eyes on every place possible where a man could hide. We have watched every hotel, every lodging house, house and every apartment house we have had everywhere in our minds, and yet never once have we had reason to think that we were near a trail." He shrugged his shoulders. "The man is simply a ghost, that's all. He eats nowhere, he drinks nowhere, and he sleeps nowhere. He only materializes when he commits a crime." The inspector smiled drily. "But my great hope now is on a porter's coat." LAROSE looked at his watch and then stood up. "Well, Mark," he said brightly, "we'll see now what we can do. You know my eccentricity, old man, don't you? I always start off from where the quarry was last seen. It gives me inspiration somehow. It always does. So if you don't mind, we'll go down to Glenelg straight away." His voice dropped to an impressive tone. "I want to see that house where the Smiter lived. I'm curious about the environment of that evil man, and I have it at the back of my mind that somehow the wretch Andrew would have been curious about it too. Remember that there is sentiment even among the beasts of crime, and between the Smiter and his associates, vile as they were in our eyes, there was real affection and loyalty, as you know. One thing more, if ever you see Andrew, shoot on sight. No calling to surrender, no pity of any kind. Shoot on the instant, for he's always got his finger on the trigger himself. He's of that type of man who will deal out hell to everyone around and keep the last barrel for himself, like the recently departed J.A. Cloud. It's his obsession never to be taken alive. Now come on."